Patrick Prill tonight. Now, many of you have seen the book that I have been offering for several weeks. Some of you have got it. I've got more copies here. And on the back, you'll see a little bit of a bio about Patrick. He's very unique. He's kind of a tent maker guy like me or others that kind of do ministry work on the side. And let me give you his background. He definitely is an advocate of theism, and he's a deep thinker. He's written a lot. He writes regular articles and blogs, and of course, this book, which is Things Atheists Say. Again, you're welcome to take a copy up here. He earned a BBA in economics from the University of Memphis, and then a master's in theology and a master's in church history from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. After concluding a career in the investment industry, so if you need to ask any investment questions, maybe Patrick can give some advice tonight. He now focuses most of his efforts on the case for God. All right. So with that, Patrick Prill. Patrick, can you say hello? Let's make sure the volume's good.
Greetings. How is it sounding?
Oh, it sounds great. It sounds great. One last little housekeeping item. The microphone we're using is here. So when we do the Q&A, I may ask you to kind of come up and speak into the microphone so Patrick can hear you really well, okay? Otherwise, I might translate just a little bit. Hello, ladies. So, Patrick, let me turn it over to you. Thank you.
Okay, sounds great. I've done a talk before entitled Atheism's Big Problems. And the challenge is there's so many big problems that you really can't cover them all in one sitting. We were originally planning to do 4, but as you can see, there's so many issues that to really give each of them the time that they really deserve, you could spend an entire evening on just one of these topics alone. We're going to try to bite off the first 3 on the list. These are some of the very big problems that atheists need to try to rationalize to justify their beliefs. The first is a beginning. The second is the apparent design of the universe. And the third is kind of unique, life after life. So let's dive in. A beginning. Back in the kind of mid-1800s through the 1900s, science had discovered the law of conservation of matter and energy. And some of the conclusions that were reached, and these are examples from Ernst Haeckel and Ludwig Buchner, who were 2 very prominent German scientists in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They rationalized that, gee, energy and matter are eternal because energy and matter can't be created or destroyed. Therefore, the energy in the universe must be constant. And if that's the case, then there's no need for a beginning. And space is probably infinite because a finite amount of space wouldn't really make sense. And so given all of this, there's really no need for God, and therefore creation must be a myth. And Lawrence Krauss, who is a physics professor at Arizona State, summarized it like this. As far as the scientific community in 1917 was concerned, the universe was static and eternal and consisted of a single galaxy, our Milky Way, surrounded by a vast, infinite, dark, and empty space. And that all sounded like great science back in the 1900s. Then a problem emerged. In about 1920, an astronomer named Edwin Hubble, through his measurements and observations, observed that the universe was actually expanding. So if the universe is expanding, what is it expanding from? And there are lots of theories about this. The first theory, probably practically speaking, was in the mid-1800s, and it was by Julius Mayer. He was one of the founders of the science of thermodynamics. And basically what he had concluded is, since heat dissipates, all of that heat must have had a common central source at one point. He called it the cause. So Then you had in the 1960s, the measurements and observations by two scientists at Bell Labs in New Jersey, Penzias and Wilson, who discovered that the microwave background radiation to the Big Bang. And so science was just turned on its head. So Lawrence Krauss, a physicist at Arizona State, concludes, as most scientists now do, that the universe began in an incredibly hot, dense Big Bang approximately 13.72 billion years ago. He's an atheist. Owen Gingerich, who is a Christian, makes the same observation. He's an astronomer at Harvard. He agrees that the universe probably began about 14 billion years ago. And Neil deGrasse Tyson, an atheist astrophysicist, says, yes, the universe had a beginning. So it seems like everyone agrees, at least most of the astronomers and physicists around today, agree that the universe had a beginning. That creates a problem for atheism. What caused it? So how can a universe with a beginning, a physical universe with a physical beginning, have had a beginning at all? And so Steven Weinberg and Lawrence Krauss basically make the same conclusion. Krauss basically says that, there's profound philosophical and religious significance to a beginning. These create all kinds of issues that you suddenly have to deal with. And then Steven Weinberg makes a similar reaction, basically saying that a beginning gives a lot of comfort to people who believe that God did it. So this is the problem. A universe that had a beginning could only have three options for what caused that beginning. It was either caused by an accident, it was caused by a necessity, or it was caused by decision. So let's take a look at Peter Atkins. He's a chemistry professor at Oxford. This is what he concluded. It sounds like he's siding on the accident kind of perspective. He said, and believe it or not, this is really what he said. At the creation, nothing did indeed come from nothing. But the original nothing was turned into a much more interesting and potent current nothing when some kind of event split nothing into electrical opposites. I guess that's the best a chemistry professor at Oxford can do. It's obvious that there's a lot of grasping at straws going on here. So if it wasn't an accident, perhaps it was a necessity. And so let's look at what Stephen Hawking had to say. And so Hawking said, because there's a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there's something rather than nothing, why the universe exists, why we exist. It's not necessary to invoke God to light the blue touch paper and set the universe going. So let's take a pause here for just a moment. If there is nothing, what could cause an accident? There's nothing to cause it. If there's nothing, then there's no law. And how can a universe create itself when a universe doesn't exist? So both of these perspectives are logically nonsensical. So then you get to the third perspective, which Lawrence Krauss, again, he's an atheist, but he has to admit that you can't logically shut the door on this option. He says the apparent logical necessity of first cause is a real issue for any universe that has a beginning. Therefore, on the basis of logic alone, one cannot rule out such a deistic view of nature. So those are the three options: an accident, a necessity, or decision. So this has a lot of atheists grasping for even more straws. So they've come up with a new solution. Since they don't like the decision solution, and since the accident and the necessity solution don't seem to be particularly viable and they're logically absurd, so Peter Atkins comes up with this as a possible. He thinks that perhaps our universe had a mother. And this is, again, pretty astonishing for an Oxford chemistry professor. He goes, it might be the case that any universe can bud into an infinite number of universes, that the current number of universes is already infinite, but increasing and possibly increasing infinitely rapidly at an infinitely accelerating rate and has been accelerating infinitely rapidly for eternity. Wow. So in this case, our universe not only had a mother, it had an infinite number of them. So the second option, and this one was posited by Edward Tryon back in, I think it was 1972 or 74. And he submitted, he calls it the modest proposal that our universe is simply one of those things that just happens from time to time. And his logic was that we've seen quantum fluctuations in a vacuum where a positron, neutron, and electron appear and then annihilate each other immediately. Perhaps that happened on a mega scale from some massive quantum fluctuation from some massive other space, and our universe just happened to happen from that. So again, he's looking for a beginning without a beginning. And then finally, Victor Stenger, New Jersey physicist, was a professor at Hawaii. He says, there's no reason why the universe had to have a beginning. The universe probably had no beginning. You see how desperately they're grasping for straws? So let me ask you this question. Which of these three ideas is supported by any evidence whatsoever?
No.
Which one?
Zero.
We're hearing zero here.
None of them.
I don't know,
None of them. None of them are actually supported by any evidence. So these are speculations by scientists. These conclusions or these hypotheses are not actually based upon evidence, which is pretty interesting. So where does the evidence actually point? Gerald Schroeder, MIT educated physicist, says this: the physical system we refer to our universe is not closed to the non-physical. It cannot be closed. Its total beginning required a non-physical act. Call it the Big Bang, call it creation. Let the creating force be a potential field if the idea of God is bothersome to you. But realize the fact that the non-physical gave rise to the physical. Neil deGrasse Tyson, atheist astrophysicist, says this: what happened before the beginning? Astrophysicists have no idea. And actually, it's a logical, I guess, absurdity to think about what happened before the beginning, because space and time came into being at the beginning. There was no such as time before the Big Bang. He goes, rather, our most creative ideas have little or no grounding in experiential science. So where the evidence does point is a non-physical beginning to a physical universe. And what has Scripture said all along? It said God is spirit, non-physical. God created from nothing. God stretched out the heavens. The universe is expanding. God suspended the earth over emptiness. And sadly, at some point, the universe is going to end. And I think that the universe is going to end comment is actually kind of interesting, because Peter, a first century Jewish fisherman who was uneducated, said that the universe was going to end as the elements melt in fervent heat. And of course, he didn't know that extreme heats, atoms, electrons, neutrons, everything melt into plasma. They literally melt. So where does the evidence point? I think it kind of points to what Scripture has said all along. And so in this case, we find that a theistic belief, especially a Christian, Judeo-Christian theistic belief, is pretty consistent with what science is now saying, but yet Christianity and Judaism have been saying this all along. So let's talk about where the evidence finally points. And this is Alan Sandage's conclusion. He was probably the second greatest astronomer in the 20th century, next to Edwin Hubble. And at the age of 50 years old, he concluded that God exists, and what caused him to make that conclusion was the Big Bang. And he said, and let me move my camera just a little bit so I can see it. He said, it was my science that drove me to the conclusion that the world is much more complicated than can be explained by science. It's only through the supernatural that I can understand the mystery of existence. And again, this is one of the great scientists of the 20th century. His conclusion was the evidence points to God. Now, the second big problem. Not only was there beginning, but what we see has the appearance of design. Now, what you'll normally hear, you'll hear arguments and comments about fine tuning. That's only a small fraction of what I want to talk about. When you see something that's designed, or just look at something, what would cause you to conclude design? So looking at the first picture, you have a pile of sand, a circle around it, it's water, and there's something sitting on top of it. Okay, is that something that would normally appear naturally on a beach? No. But it doesn't look, exquisitely designed. So perhaps some sort of weird accident could have caused that. Then you look at the next picture and it's like, excuse me, this is something that has multiple components. It's organized. It does something specifically. It's actually pretty beautiful. It looks engineered. That could possibly be designed. And then you look at the Colosseum and you look at the standard architecture. You look at the lifts and pulleys and elevators that were built into it, and you can conclude that they were actually performed some useful function. And then you look at a butterfly, and this one I thought was pretty extraordinary. How does that just happen? Look at the symmetry of the 3 circles on the top, the 3 circles on the bottom. Look at the shading. Look at the parallel lines, both in the circles and along the edges. Look at the venation, the coloration of it. It's just absolutely extraordinary. So when we look at something and think, well, maybe it was designed, we tend to make that decision based upon how it's organized, whether it has standard components, whether it has standard forces, whether, what makes it work, whether it looks like it was constructed, the way it operates, how precise it is, whether it's understandable, whether it's beautiful, complex, whether there's some sort of logical progression to it, and whether it has a purpose. Okay. Using that list, let's take a look at the universe. And this is the problem that atheists have. What we do not see is a mess. Paul Davies, physicist at Arizona State, said, instead of finding that space is filled with a dog's breakfast of unrelated bric-a-brac, astronomers see an orchestrated and coherent unity. On the largest scale of size, there's order and uniformity. So we don't see a mess. What do we see? Freeman Dyson, physicist, if I remember correctly, at Princeton. I do not claim that the architecture of the universe proves the existence of God. I claim that the architecture of the universe is consistent with the hypothesis that mind plays an essential role in its functioning. So we don't see is a mess. What we do see looks like it's orchestrated, coherent, and architected. That's a problem for atheists, because who did it? And let's look at some of these things just real quickly. And I don't know how many of you are science majors, physics, chemistry, etc. So for some of you, this will be very elementary. For some of you, this will be 10 times more science than you ever wanted. So I'll try to cover it at a very high level and not get bogged down. But what we saw was Paul Davies talked about that the universe at the highest level was incredibly organized and coherent. Well, guess what? When you drill all the way down to the smallest level, you see the same characteristics. This is the map of fundamental particle physics. Okay, this is called the standard model. Standard model is up on the upper left. Okay, what you see, as most of you remember from your high school chemistry class, you have atoms that have a nucleus, which consists of protons and neutrons and electrons. Okay, I believe hydrogen does not have an electron. One hydrogen isotope does not. Then you have protons. When I was in high school, protons were like this solid thing. And then after I got out of high school, they figured out, wow, protons are actually composed of 2 up quarks and 1 down quark and gluons. And oh, by the way, each one of those quarks have one of 3 different color charges. And the only way that the quarks can go together is if the color charges are all 3 different. And then you have neutrons that are composed of 2 down quarks and 1 up quark, gluons. And again, each quark has 3 different color charges. Then they think there's something called mesons, which are quark-antiquark pairs that help hold the protons and neutrons in place. And this is the kind of stuff that gets really kind of mind-boggling when you start to think about it. There's something called the Pauli exclusion principle. So when you're in high school, you'd see all these diagrams of electrons, spinning around the nucleus. And you'd see the electrons at kind of different layers. Well, it's kind of like air traffic control, where you have different shells of electrons, and then you have orbitals within those shells. The Pauli exclusion principle says that no electrons can share the same quantum space. So you only have 2 electrons in each shell, and they each have opposite spin. And then there's a maximum number of electrons per shell with a specific mathematical equation that describes it. 2 times n squared, with n being the shell number. Now that's pretty crazy, because if this didn't exist, there would be no molecules. There would be no chemistry. There would be no people. There would be basically almost nothing if it were not for the Pauli exclusion principle. And then on top of that, there's 26 constants. So you see this incredibly organized set of things at the smallest level. But this incredibly organized set of small things are also standardized. Okay, if I got a great big bucket of Legos and dumped them out on the floor, how many different ways are there to put those Legos together?
Probably.
There's several ways. Some of them are big, little, but you know what? They all have the kind of the same mechanisms that hold them together. And the thing that's kind of interesting is, and the same is true like of a house. If you go by a house, well, houses are made of wood studs. They're made 16 inches on center for each stud. You have standards that every home is built according to. The rafters and the roof, I believe, have to be 20 inches on center. There's all of these standards. Okay. You see the same thing at the smallest level. There's 4 fundamental forces, 17 fundamental particles if you don't count all of there's a minimum 17. The maximum, I think, is like 61. The standard components. So, okay, let's just skip to kind of the quarks and to not bog down too much. But an up quark has 4 characteristics. It has a charge of plus 2/3. It has a mass of 2.2 mega electron volts over the speed of light squared. It has a spin of a half and an RGB color charge. The down quark has a charge of minus 1/3, the mass of 4.7 mega electron volts over the speed of light squared, the spin of a half, and a red, green, blue color charge. all of them basically fit the definition of standard components. And then you have something called gluons, which are force carriers, and they call them gluons because they literally glue the quarks together. They have no mass, spin, or charge, but they do have a color charge. These are the standard components without which no atom exists. This is what you are made out of. Then you have incredible precision. Now, you hear a lot about fine-tuning in the universe. And when you hear about that, you hear, there's like 30 knobs that if things weren't exactly precisely like that within 1% tolerance, the universe either wouldn't exist or it wouldn't exist, in the way that it does. So for example, they believe that at the Big Bang, there was 1,000,000,001 particles of matter for every 1 billion particles of antimatter. If there had just been a few more particles of matter, the universe would basically be, I guess, some sort of concentrated mega lump of stuff. And if there was a little bit more antimatter, there'd be nothing here. Then you have the cosmological constant, which is basically the rate at which the universe is expanding. If it expanded a little bit faster, there would be no planets. If it expanded a little bit slower, again, everything would be just one kind of glump of matter. There wouldn't be any planets. And the one number that's probably the craziest number of all is called the fine structure constant. And it describes the strength of the interaction of electrons and photons. And within classical physics, it roughly approximates the ratio of the speed of electron to the speed of light. And it's approximately 1 over 137 point, whole bunch of numbers. And Richard Feynman, Nobel Prize winning physicist, had this to say about it, because it's a crazy number. It shows up all over physics, and there's no real explanation for it. He goes, it's one of the greatest damn mysteries of physics, a magic number that comes to us with no understanding by man. You might say the hand of God wrote that number, and we don't know how he pushed his pencil. So it's like the precision in the universe is astonishing. And that precision is basically mediated and governed by a whole set of laws. It's consistent operation. They cover motion, gravity, electrodynamics, optics, thermodynamics, particle physics, you name it. And then there's forces. Yeah, electromagnetic force that kind of makes your iPhone work, right? That turn the lights on, that's electromagnetic. Then you have the strong nuclear force. That's what holds the protons and neutrons together. The weak nuclear force enables protons and neutrons to kind of decay and turn into each other. And then you have gravity. Now that great big explosion over there is the strong nuclear force. That's what's in an atom. That's pretty crazy. And then you got purpose and progression. And this is pretty interesting. This is actually Arno Penzias. He's the guy, one of the two guys who discovered the background radiation to the universe. And he said, let me move my screen so I can see this. Astronomy leads us to a unique event, a universe which was created out of nothing and delicately balanced to provide exactly the conditions required to support life. In the absence of an absurdly improbable accident, the observations of modern science seem to suggest an underlying, one might say, supernatural plan. And then finally, the universe is intelligible. And this amazed Albert Einstein. So if this universe were an accident, why could we understand it? Why would it not be the biggest mess you've ever imagined? Instead, Einstein goes, the eternal mystery of the world is its comprehensibility. The fact that it's comprehensible is a miracle. He was a deist. And then you have Roger Penrose, who I think is probably also a deist. He says there's something absolute and God-given about mathematical truth. Real mathematical truth goes beyond mere man-made constructs. This is a guy who won a Nobel Prize, who's one of the greatest mathematical physicists who's ever lived in the history of the universe. This guy is so crazy smart that he taught Stephen Hawking. And then you have beauty. Steven Weinberg, atheist. Actually, in many respects, he's an anti-theist based upon the comments he's made in many of his speeches. He said, I have to admit that sometimes nature seems more beautiful than strictly necessary. And you know what? I would argue with his comment. I would be so emphatic as to say none of it had to be beautiful. Why are sunsets beautiful? Why are flowers beautiful? Why are blades of grass, puppies, spiders, you know? Why are girls so beautiful? You know, it's an amazing thing. It's like none of it had to be beautiful. How could it be accidentally beautiful? And how could we all share the same delusion of its beauty? This is what's pretty amazing. So what causes you to conclude something is beautiful? You see symmetry, color, contrast, patterns, texture, light. Did that happen by accident? Okay, now the big question is this. So maybe the universe does have some attributes of design. Maybe it looks like it, but has it always looked that way? And the answer is absolutely yes. Again, Roger Penrose, Nobel Prize winning physicist, he goes, the precision needed to set the universe on its course is seen to be in no way inferior to all of the other extraordinary precision that we've already become accustomed to in the superb dynamical equations. So these would be Newton's laws of motion, Maxwell's laws, Einstein, which govern the behavior of things from moment to moment. But why was the Big Bang so precisely organized? And then Frank Close, who's a particle physicist, observed, as the universe aged, and this is what he's talking about aging, as the universe aged, it cooled at first very quickly. Within a millionth of a second, quarks clustered together in threes where they've remained ever since. So there's never been a time where the universe didn't look organized and have the attributes of design. But there's still a few holdouts. So Victor Stenger, universe and life do not look at all designed. They look just as if they would be expected to look if they were not designed at all. Well, if they're not designed at all, I would think it'd be a massive mess. You know, and it seems that almost no other physicists agree with him. So in his, attempt to justify his new atheism, I think he's going way out on a limb that most other physicists would not agree with. And then you have Kai Nielsen, philosopher. He actually died, I think, in 2021. He goes, but the order we observe, which is surely order in the universe and not of the universe, is such that it hardly evidences the mark of a perfect designer. Rather, if a designer at all, it bears the marks of an apprentice designer or a decrepit designer whose powers and insight were failing. Again, these guys are really, really grasping at straws. They're really trying to hold on to a very, very outdated perspective that science no longer supports. So what about the idea of a multiverse? And a lot of you have probably heard about this. And the idea is this: to have one universe that looks like ours, that's so incredibly congenial to life, a universe that is so structured, that's so organized, that's so beautiful, that's so comprehensible. In order for one universe like this to exist, there has to be essentially an infinite number of universes for one like this to randomly occur. And Victor Stenger, again, he's really, really grasping at that straw. He goes, we've no reason to assume there aren't many universes, even if our particular universe is highly unlikely, the chance that we are one of many could be as high as 100%. Now, my first observation on this is, Mr. Stenger, I thought you were a scientist. Scientists don't assume things. They make conclusions based upon evidence. Number two, if our particular universe were unlikely, the chances that we're one of many would be as high as 100%. It's like, excuse me, that's a logical absurdity. It's like, that makes no sense at all. The universe the multiverse idea has a lot of problems. The first is there's no evidence of any other universe. The second is that all of the evidence points to a beginning with a non-physical cause. And then there's massive number of logical problems. First, it's a guess. So George Ellis, who's a physicist, South Africa, just really, really blasts it as a metaphysical guess. So does, I believe it's Polkinghorne and out of Cambridge. Okay, and even if a multiverse did exist, which there's no evidence of it, it would have to have a collision prevention feature. Because if there's an infinite number of them, they'd be banging into each other, exploding all over the place. I have never in my life seen one universe explode into existence. Have you? If there's an infinite number, they'd be happening all the time. And the only way we wouldn't see it is if there's some sort of collision prevention feature, which would mean that there was a law that precluded them from banging into each other, which would mean that there had to be some logical or pre-existing source of that non-collision, that collision prevention feature. And then the other logical absurdity is, why would a universe generating process not make them all the same? He assumes that they would all be made differently, but why? If there's a process that does it, why would that process not make them all the same? And what would start that process or law? So there's some physicists that are playing around with this idea of the idea of quantum gravity, which the first problem with quantum gravity is that things on a large scale and things on a small scale, theories of relativity and quantum physics don't fit together. They can't get them to fit in any way yet. And it also assumes that, you know, what they basically say is that assuming that there was no space-time, no energy, no laws, that there would still be a pre-existing process to start it. You're going, wait a minute. A pre-existing non-physical process that would start the universe going. So again, they have to start with something, but a process doesn't exist if there's not something that the process does. And then the next one is our universe is finite. Why? If there's an infinite number of universes, why wouldn't they all be infinite? You know, why is ours finite? And then the most absurd one is there would be an almost infinite number of you. But the good news is there would be a version of you that would be a straight A student, that would be a scratch golfer, that would win Miss America, Mr. Universe, and would have all the friends on the planet and would be a multi-billionaire.
Everything, everywhere, all at once.
Yeah. So there's really two options with this whole design idea. The universe just happens to be the way it is for no reason. And in a way, this picture isn't accurate because if they're correct, there's not even a slot machine. There's nothing. Or there's some intelligence that designed it, constructed it, and operates it. And call that intelligence God. I'm sorry, did somebody ask a question?
No, just coffee.
Okay. So what would a reasonable conclusion be actually based on evidence? So here we have a deist, and a Christian. Owen Gingerich, again, an astronomer at Harvard, and Paul Davies, a physicist at Arizona State. Davies says, I do take my life, mind, and purpose seriously, and I concede that the universe at least appears to be designed with a high level of ingenuity. I cannot accept these features as a package of marvels that just happen to be, that exist reasonlessly. He's trying to sort out, does God exist? Do I believe in a personal God? I kind of believe in a deistic God, but I can't accept this universe as just a reasonless accident. And then you have Owen Gingerich, who says, to me, belief in a final cause, a creator God, gives a coherent understanding of why the universe seems so congenially designed for the existence of intelligent, self-reflective life. And what has the Bible said for, this is King David, what's that, 1000 BC roughly? The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day, they pour forth speech. Night after night, they display knowledge. There's no speech or language where their voice isn't heard. Their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. And this is what we call basically natural revelation. It's like general revelation that you can learn a lot about God just by what we see. And a lot of astronomers and physicists are reaching that conclusion. So that was the second big problem. Okay, catch your breath. Breathe deeply. 1, 2, 3. Now we're going to go to the third. This one is actually pretty crazy when you think about it. In the mid-1950s, Bertrand Russell said famously, I believe that when I die, I shall rot, and nothing of my ego will survive. And then in 2009, Steven Weinberg said, as religious belief weakens, more and more of us know, catch that word, know, that after death, there's nothing. But excuse me, Stephen, you also say in the same book, science has nothing to say one way or another about the existence of God or an afterlife. Its goal is to find explanations of natural phenomena that are purely natural. So here Bertrand Russell believes that when he dies, he's going to rot. And then you have Steven Weinberg saying that we know that there's nothing after death, but he also says that science has nothing to say about the afterlife, God, or what happens after death. So this is the problem. People are actually returning from the dead. They're being resuscitated. My daughter is a critical care, cardiac critical care and intensive care nurse, okay? And they had people code, sadly, with all too great a frequency. And fortunately, many of them, they're able to rescue. And in the 1800s, this was seen as impossible. Robert Ingersoll, who's probably the most famous American atheist during that time, said no person has come back from the unseen world. And then again, in the mid-1900s, it was seen as highly, highly improbable, according to Bertrand Russell. But it's happening all the time. And the first book that really dealt with this in a significant way was Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life, in the 1970s. And it really struck it picked everybody's interest. It's like he interviewed all these people who had been resuscitated and what they experienced. Well, it really got the attention of the scientific community. And so a lot of studies were then planned. So there was a Dutch study in 1988 to 92, and they call this a prospective study because evidently they planned it ahead of time, rather than going back and finding people who'd experienced things. This was a prospective study. They had 344 patients who were resuscitated. All of them had been clinically dead. 62% of them reported a near-death experience. And in this case, a more accurate term would be an after-death experience, ADE, but they generally call them NDEs. Of these people, 50% were aware when they were dead. About 30% had a tunnel experience, saw dead people or a celestial landscape. 25% had an out-of-body experience. 13% saw their life in review. 8% experienced a border that couldn't be crossed. Then you had a 2014 study at the University of Southampton in the United Kingdom. 2,060 people died. 330 were resuscitated. 140 participated in the survey. 39% were aware while they were being brought back. 13% had out-of-body experiences. 2023 study, smaller, in the US and UK, said some survivors had positive memories, such as seeing a light, a tunnel, or family member, feeling intense emotions such as love, tranquility, and peace. Others, however, had a feeling of separation from the body and a recognition they had died or had delusions of monsters or faceless figures. It's kind of scary. Now there is a database of all these. There's over 1,000 people, their experiences. And this stuff is pretty crazy because of this 1,000 some odd people who experienced after-death experiences and near-death experiences, 77% of them had incredible peace. 75% had an out-of-body experience. 65% saw light. 60% experienced altered time or space. 58% saw other deceased people or beings. 51% described an unearthly realm. 33% that they were passing through a tunnel. And sadly, 20% experienced a hellish isolation or damnation experience. Then they did a follow-up with 420 of these people. 40, because they didn't ask some of these questions the first time. 40% were aware of God. And what was interesting is, of all these people, their belief in God dramatically skyrocketed. It increased from 39% to almost 73% of the people who said God definitely exists. Okay, are these experiences real? Well, 95% of these people are convinced that they're real. 95%. 92% of the out-of-body experience events were actually confirmed. So they looked at 89 cases of out-of-body experiences. 92% of them were completely accurate. So let me give you a perspective on this. In some cases, these out-of-body experiences where people left their body, they traveled into the next room, then they went through the tunnel and all this other stuff. They were brought back to life. And what they described wasn't just what was happening in the operating room while they were dead. They described what was happening in the next room accurately. And what's really startling is, I'll cover this in a couple of seconds. At least one of those people who described those events accurately had been blind since birth. That's pretty freaky. And then you have 75% of the people who experienced these things, their lives were changed. Most of them made large changes to their life. About 25% made medium changes to their life. So when you think of these people, go, okay, not all of them experienced exactly the same things, but they did thematically experience very similar things. Not all of them experienced all of those things. But what about alternate causes? And they look, the scientists who have evaluated this, and these are medical doctors doing this research. The medical doctors have concluded that duration of cardiac arrest was not significantly correlated to any of these. They were not hallucinations because these experiences were lucid, organized, and chronological, and hallucinations are not. It was not correlated to medication, wasn't correlated to culture because even small children had them. Were these people semi-conscious? Well, some of them described events in other rooms. And again, even blind people who had the out-of-body experiences accurately described things that had happened. . Religion was not positively or negatively correlated. Education was not. where they imagined most of these people were clinically dead. There were more people who experienced them below 60 years of age than older, and it was not correlated to their fear or lack of fear and death. So what are the implications if these are real? And again, this is a statistically significant group of people reporting very, very similar things. So if these are real, the first implication is that your consciousness does not end at death. And therefore, you really can have a soul spirit that departs your body, independent of your body. The second is that there is a place where the dead go, heavenly or hellish. And sadly, it's a small group, about 20%. And many people didn't want to report. They found that the people who had bad experiences didn't want to talk about them. And then the third implication is God and people are there. And this is Jeffrey Long, who wrote God and the Afterlife. He's a medical doctor. He's one of the people who've been involved in a lot of these studies. He said, the good news is that throughout this book, you can easily see that the evidence consistently points to a blissful heavenly realm and a God that loves us, loves us all profoundly and completely. That is, in my opinion, the most significant and important messages in the study of NDEs. It's kind of interesting for a medical doctor. So what does the Bible say about all this stuff? I want to read you something from the book of Luke. Okay. And this is what Jesus said a long, long time ago, 2,000 years ago. And again, I've got to move my camera a little bit because I can't read the small print very well. So please bear with me. This is in Luke 16. And in Luke 16, Jesus tells many parables. Okay. If this is a parable, this is the only parable that we are aware of in the New Testament where Jesus actually mentions a person's name. I think that's pretty significant. So this is something I believe to be much more significant because a person is mentioned. And it starts off, there was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and lived in luxury every day. At his gate was laid a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores and longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs came to lick his sores. The time came when the beggar died, and the angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was in torment, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. So he called to him, Father Abraham, have pity on me, and said, Lazarus, to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue because I'm in agony in this fire. But Abraham replied, Son, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things while Lazarus received bad things, but now he's comforted here and you're in agony. And besides all this, between us and you is a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over from there to us. He answered, Then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers. Let him warn them so they'll not also come to this place of torment. Abraham replied, Take Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them. No, Father Abraham, he said, but if someone from the dead goes to them, they'll repent. He said to him, if they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, they won't be convinced even if someone rises from the dead. And you know what? This sounds a lot like what people are experiencing with these after death and near death experiences. They're coming back and they're telling people what they experienced. And if these people are telling the truth, soul and spirit survives beyond death. There's a place of comfort and there's a place of torment. And according to Jesus in this story, repentance affects the outcome, and listening to scripture affects the outcome. And when I think about these kind of experiences, when you think about evidence for God, and this is what we're going to conclude on. There's natural evidence, general revelation from nature. There's historical evidence. A lot of that's from the Bible. You have personal experience, which you cannot discount that. And I think it's interesting that roughly 80% of people who attend church at least once a month say that they experience God's presence when they're there. 80%. It's hard to discount that. And then you have other types of experience, and those experiences are other people's experiences. So when I hear about experiences from other people, the first thing I ask is, are they credible? Are there multiple people saying the same thing? Are their accounts consistent? Is there other confirmation? And is there other possible causation? And I think it's interesting that, again, in a massive number of the experiences of people who experienced out-of-body experiences, the people who were in the operating room or in the area when the dead person was resuscitated, they confirmed the events that that person reported seeing while they were dead. There's a huge number of people saying the same thing. They're credible sources, children, people from a variety of different backgrounds. Is there other possible causation? If there is, the doctors haven't figured it out. Is this 100% proof? No. But I think it's evidence that has to be taken seriously. And, when you look at the types of evidence for God, there's such a vast array of types. We've only talked about a couple of them tonight. We talked about some of the natural types of evidence and experiential, but there's also prophetic, there's moral, there's logical, the whole idea of personal volition. How can something made out of matter, out of atoms and matter actually have choices? There's all kinds of evidence. And the thing that I really love about Ratio Christi is it's a forum that people can explore. That they can explore these ideas, that they can explore the evidence, that you can discuss it, that you can debate it, that you can kind of get your heads around it. I didn't have a group like this when I was in college, and I think it's great that you do. End of story.
Right, let's give an applause to Patrick. Thank you, Patrick. I especially like the NDE presentation. Some of you might recall we had a man, Cameron Rhodes, with us last semester, and he talked about his NDE, and it wasn't a good experience. You might recall the life change that came from that for him. So great stuff, Patrick. We really appreciate that. Let me start off with a question, and then y'all jump in after that, okay? Anything that you want. First off, Patrick, we really appreciate you spending time with us. He's an hour ahead. You're in South Carolina?
Yes.
Yes, South Carolina. I just want to know your life as a Christian and apologetics, and how that has helped or not helped, or how you got into it. Give us a little backstory on Patrick and why you do what you do.
I started off in management consulting, first with a couple of regional banks, then with Deloitte for 10 years, and working mostly for large money center banks, securities industry, institutional custodians, that kind of thing. Then went onto the investment industry directly as at Morgan Stanley, and then at a few major hedge funds. And the thing that I found, I think the thing that got me going on a lot of these subjects, when I first moved to New York, which I lived just outside of New York for, I don't know, almost 30 years, a lot of my colleagues were Orthodox, Reform, conservative Jews, and many non-religious Jews. And, my perception of Judaism was what I saw in the Bible. But when I was talking to them on a daily basis, what they believed sounded very different. So I had to get my head around first, what do they believe? Okay. Then I had to try to figure out, how do I explain to them that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah? Why is it that 3 billion people on the planet believe that this first century Jewish guy is the Messiah, in a way that people who were educated at UPenn and Columbia and Harvard would receive? So that was my kind of first venture into apologetics, and that's the first book I wrote. Then the second kind of venture was, and I went to seminary while I was at work. I would take the train up to Boston on the weekends and such. But my kids started coming home with ideas, and so I cite two examples. One was my daughter. One of her friends basically concluded that because God does not exist, there's no such thing as morality. And this is a young girl. She's probably 16 at the time, from Asia. And my daughter was trying to kind of get her head around, well, how do I respond to her? And then one of my son's friends' dad was an atheist, and my son started coming home, and his mom is Christian. We didn't know the dad was an atheist. He started coming home with the Victor Stenger books and a variety of other books. And so I had the decision to, ignore it, get angry about it, or intellectually engage. So I chose to intellectually engage. And that kind of started my journey with all this in a really, really meaningful way. And I think the encouragement that I would have for you guys is that you can serve the Lord and work for a hedge fund. You can serve the Lord and be an engineer. You can serve the Lord and work for Morgan Stanley or Deloitte and Touche. It's not an either or. God basically, for me, said, serve me while you work. And it's like, I was able to be involved in people's lives who would never step into a church. And the thing that I encourage you in is, think of yourself as a multi-dimensional creation of God. You can do a whole lot more stuff than you think.
Got it. Thanks, Patrick, for that. And if you stop sharing, then I think we'll get a full screen of you as we go into the Q&A session. Let's give that a shot. There you go.
It's the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah, there you are. Yeah. So any other questions for Patrick? Yes, Robbie.
What does it mean to be clinically dead? What organs are working?
Yeah, there's very precise definitions of that, but the primary ones would be, your heart has stopped and there is no visible brain function. You basically have coded. They call it coding. And you're dead. And if they don't get your heart going quick, you're done.
So let me get this straight. You claim there's people who were aware while the brain wasn't functioning.
That is what,
right.
In the different studies, some of them break it out very, very specifically. And I guess the thing I would encourage you to do, these are two really nice books. This one is The Science of Near-Death Experience. It was written by John Hagen III, medical doctor. He's actually also in charge of the Journal of Missouri State Medical Association. So the guy's legit. And then Jeffrey Long, God in the Afterlife. He again is a medical doctor. And in their books, they describe in a much, much greater level of detail the many different studies and what the different studies were looking for. So it's difficult to kind of lump them all together as a group because specific studies, some of them were prospective studies. They were looking for very, very specific things. So, one study would be, primarily, if a person was in cardiac arrest. So that was their definition of death. And another study, it would be something slightly different. So I can't give you the details on all of the studies, but I would encourage you to take a look at both of those books. They're both available on Amazon, and they outlined a lot of the studies that have been performed.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I have a quick question. What are like some really like important things to like bear in mind when discussing these subjects with people who like we don't want to like come off to like too abrasive or something? Like how do you kind of approach this from a very talkative, like not too
Not
abrasive,
argumentative.
argumentative way?
Conversational.
Yeah. So the thing I tried to do in Things Atheists Say is I found that at the time, my kids were in high school and in college, so they're pretty smart. I mean, Purdue, Virginia Tech kind of schools. But what I found is that the average person is only going to give you a certain amount of time. And so I found that when I had these conversations, I would get at most 2 minutes, right? So I had to cut to the chase, get to the big point, and do it in 2 minutes or less. So for example, on the beginning one, it's like, I would just cut to the chase and say, wow, the universe had a beginning. All these physicists agree. So if the universe actually had a beginning, it had to be in an accident or a necessity or decision. But if it's an accident, there'd be nothing that would cause it. If it's a necessity, if the universe doesn't exist, nothing can necessitate it. So to me, it's logical that it's a decision. Done. See what I mean? You try to get to the essence of the argument quickly. And then if they're really interested, and I did that, 30 seconds maybe? If they're really interested, it turns into a conversation. And that conversation can go on for 20 minutes. If they're not, at least you've planted the big idea. And the same like on the design idea, it's like, look, this isn't about, the fine tuning of the universe, because the universe, maybe it's just, maybe just things are the way they are because that's the way they are. But the argument that I'm making for fine tuning is like, no, it's like, or the idea of design is, it's not just fine tuning. It's the way the universe appears to be designed, constructed, the standard components, the way it operates, 4 fundamental forces, not one. It's all of those things put together. It's like, if this were an accident, everything would come from like one thing, or everything would come from chaos. But it doesn't. It's structured and it's organized. Again, boom, that was the big idea.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, and it's very much like a sort of this is something I've been thinking about. That's really good. I appreciate that.
And just to add, I've talked about it at the Science and Faith Conference. It's February 17th, Saturday. Ratio Christie will discount your tickets. So you pay $8 only. I think the price right now is around $30. So we've already got 6 of us going, and got room in my car for one more, but we've got other cars that are going down as well. So it's a great conference to hear about scientists, PhD level folks, and all of these discussions. So yeah, it's coming up real quick. Any other questions? Yes, Dalton.
Yeah, I saw earlier in the second topic about, the design of the universe. And one of the things that stood out to me was how they were saying that the universe itself seems to be designed to support not only life, but sentient life. And my question would be, like, how do you, if the universe itself is designed to support life, like as a whole, how come we haven't, you know, found any evidence of any other life anywhere else in the universe?
Patrick, did you hear that question?
Yeah, and so what you really have, it's a similar kind of set of options. Okay, some people, and again, I'm not talking about theists or deists or atheists, I'm just talking in general. You know, some speculate, is there a law that requires life to emerge? So these would be, you know, a lot of the purely naturalistic kind of perspectives. Is there a law? If there is, no one has ever found it. Okay. So that kind of rules out necessity. It doesn't appear to be a necessity, or if it is a necessity, no one has a clue as to what would necessitate it. So especially when you get to origin of life studies, the gentleman, and I think it's Tulane, Mr. Tour, who is a
James Tour.
synthetic chemist. I'm sorry, what's his first name?
James Tour?
Yeah, I think that's him. He's a synthetic chemist. And again,
Yeah.
this is what he does, right? He tries to make things out of chemicals. And his conclusion is scientists are absolutely and totally clueless about the origin of life. Clueless. They have no idea. So if there's a law that requires life, no one has a clue as to what that law is or how it works. Okay, so again, if there's no necessity, then did life happen as an accident? And again, there's no evidence that it happened as an accident because they can't figure out the logical leaps of how do you get dead matter to turn into life? Again, Tour goes, nobody has any clues to how it could happen. And so really then you're kind of left with, you know, we have a universe that is incredibly congenial to life, you know, and according to the gentleman who's on the Cosmos TV show, Sagan. Yeah, Sagan basically said, you know, and NASA concurs with this today. We've never found so much as a microbe anywhere else in the universe. The only place there's life is here. And the probability that it exists anywhere else randomly is so astronomically improbable that biologists have basically concluded that if life didn't exist today and you rewound the clock, would life exist? The probability is no. That's how improbable it is. But yet we're here. And so that's a whole nother subject that's worthy of an entire evening. But it relates to some of the same type of basic logical problems.
But just a couple comments to add to what Patrick is saying. One, James Tour was at the Science and Faith Conference last year. I don't know if he's going to be there this year, but he's an amazing intellect. And if he's not there, if you want to see some of his videos, just DM me and I'll send you a couple of his videos on YouTube, and I think you'll be blessed by that. Two, I really like Dalton's question, because if the world is, or the universe is all a great accident, I would be asking the same questions. Like, how did it all just center here, life on this earth, and not somewhere else? And of course, that's what a lot of people are asking. The SETI project, I don't know if you're familiar with that, SETI. The SETI project is an example of people, materialists, maybe saying there ought to be life somewhere else. And we're going to set up an antenna and listen for information coming from some other place in the universe. And that started around 1997. And to date, you know, no other information has hit that antenna that would give an indication that there's intelligence out there. Because the fact that there's life on Earth and not in the heavens aligns with Scripture, with the Judeo-Christian Scripture. So in that regard, I think, yeah, thank you.
I don't know if you can see these. I
yes, Scott.
highly recommend these.
Okay.
And
Very good.
it deals with the whole idea. They call it the Copernican principle. The Copernican principle basically is, gee, you know, the Earth is not the center of the universe, and there's a whole lot of planets out there. So if you have enough planets, there's probably another one like ours. Okay. Owen Gingerich deals with that head on. The thing I love about this guy is the books are short to the point. He's a Harvard astronomer, so he has the academic credentials, and he just blows the whole idea of the Copernican principle into smithereens. And he just happens to be one of the world's experts on Copernicus. But it's a wonderful little book. It's a really quick read. And for a Harvard professor, he's an incredibly good communicator.
Yeah, amazing. Meredith.
Okay, so if the whole premise here is that the universe can't come from nothing, so therefore God comes in to create it, there's always going to be the question of where did God come from, using that same logic.
Yeah,
So
the logic is, you know, there's the first cause of the first cause of the first cause. Okay. And Leibniz dealt with a bunch of this stuff back in what, the 1700s or so. And basically his conclusion was that the first cause of a series cannot have occurred from within the series. And that's the principle of sufficient reason that he was trying to use there. What they have found is that the universe did have a cause. The cause was non-physical. Okay. It's very difficult for us to then opine on what that non-physical is like, because we're using physical constructs to try to get our head around it. And not only are we using physical constructs, we're using space-time constructs, which are very difficult to get your head around. But if God exists, and I obviously thoroughly believe he does, he's not bound by space-time because he's not material. And how there can be an infinite, non-physical God, I can't get my head around. And I don't know that anybody can, because we are pretty bound to physical constructs. But the only conclusion, the logical conclusion that science is pointing to, not the only, but the logical conclusion is a non-physical cause. And again, this is what the Bible's been saying for, you know, thousands of years. And the thing I think is also interesting, which is again a topic for another day, when you actually look at the chronology that you see in the creation story, and things like it says that the earth was entirely covered by water. Well, science is now saying that. This is new. You know, and the thing that I think is fascinating is that if the Bible and science were so at odds, why is it that the more that science is learning, the closer that they're becoming, not the further they're getting apart?
Yeah.
That's what I think is interesting.
Yeah.
So I can't answer all of it. I don't know what happened before the beginning. I don't know what God is like. I can't describe the non-physical, but the evidence points to a non-physical cause.
Yeah. And just to add to that, Meredith, you know, there are things outside of time, space, and matter, like Patrick said, that we can't comprehend. But this we can comprehend. Within time, space, an actual infinity is impossible, right? And Hilbert's Hotel is the best example or model of that. You can just Google it, you'll see videos and all kinds of things. So God says he himself is infinite. And so that makes sense to me, because he is outside time, space, and matter. So then he can be infinite. Within time, space, and matter, it's just a mathematical idea. So it's accept what God says about himself, that he is infinite. So he's the first cause and there's nothing prior. But there is no prior because there's no time.
Right.
Does that make sense? No time in that before the beginning of time, which is mind blowing stuff.
And
And also,
at the
Oh, wait, Rob.
beginning, it wasn't just matter and energy that happened. Matter and energy, space and time, and laws all came into existence simultaneously. Boom.
Mind blowing. Any other questions, comments? I know we're at 8, so we're getting ready to wrap it up. Okay, yeah, one more, Ray.
I think it's a really big stretch to present the near-death experiences as credible evidence for, God or afterlife, because, I mean, it's understandable how people are enamored with those stories. But I think if they were real, like 98% of them would be hellish experiences and not these blissful experiences. And furthermore, wasn't there like a really big bestseller about some little boy and it turned out to be totally fake, So I think it's really flimsy, really flimsy evidence. But it's interesting, but I don't think, compared to scripture, I think it's a really big stretch.
Yeah, Patrick
I guess
responded to that and Carmen's
The
got
thing that I would add to that is that, I was hedging that not everybody experienced the same things. Okay. And the thing that I do find very, very interesting is that the studies that are being done now are not anecdotal studies. The studies that they're being done now they're confirming that people are dead. They're confirming that the events that happened, that these people report during out-of-body experiences actually happened. Okay. So the level of meticulous study that is taking place is dramatically greater than the anecdotal stories from the first Life After Life book in the 1970s.
Mm-hmm.
And then from a personal standpoint, I know 2 people who have experienced these. One is my cousin and one is one of my neighbors. And they both described very, very similar things. The neighbor was a very non-religious type guy. My cousin was a nominally religious person who became totally convinced when this happened to him in his 30s. And so it's like, again, I would agree with you that the original wave of stories and things that came out, a lot of this was anecdotal. It wasn't being confirmed. Some of these stories are literally just people making it up to make a movie or something. But the level of detail that's going into them now is materially different. And I again, I don't say that this proves God, but I think it's very, very interesting evidence, especially in the way that these studies are being performed today.
Yeah, good point. The book that I put into the group chat is statistically sound. The guy spent his career kind of doing this, and so if you're interested in that, not just anecdotes, that's good. I'd also say, Ray, that it's probably not evidence for God in a hard, direct line, but it is maybe evidence for the soul, for the immaterial part of a being, which aligns with Scripture and is also one more in the cumulative case, towards God and theism. So maybe that's one way to think of it. But yes, Carmen.
I also want to add to that, like even in the Bible, Paul describes him having an out-of-body experiences of heaven and stuff, and how he encountered an angel and stuff like that. I forgot what chapter it is on, but he describes it like vividly. So and it's right, there are people who fake it, but then at the same time there are people who genuinely did have those experiences.
Yeah, why would they make up that they went to hell? Like literally something.
Yeah, and then like people, yeah, and like, but like I've seen videos where people come out like just terrified,
Yeah.
express things that I wouldn't even think in my own natural
Mhm.
capacity.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it was
It's
noteworthy in many of these books. I think it was in Jeffrey Long's book that he was saying that the people who had great experiences were much more willing to talk about it than the people who did not.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, listen, we need to wrap up. Patrick, it's a 9/11 your time. So we really greatly appreciate another round of applause for Patrick. Yeah. Patrick, you've really blessed us. Thank you so much. And we'll continue to stay in touch.
My pleasure. Take
All
care.
right. Okay, thanks. Bye-bye. So